In 1808, fur trader Simon Fraser was looking for a way to the Pacific Ocean. The Northwest Company had just established a fur trade outpost at Fort George in what would one day become Prince George, British Columbia. With 24 company men, he headed south through a large river that he thought must have been a tributary for the Columbia River, which was the only major river known to feed out to the west coast. More than a month later, Fraser's expedition had nearly reached the coast, but after making a latitude measurement, Fraser found that they were nowhere near where the Columbia River should be. Somewhat lost, and beginning to sense hostility from the Musqueam natives on whose territory they were trespassing, they turned around and paddled all the way back to Fort George. Many years after this single week in the lower mainland, the river and the entire valley through which Fraser traveled a single time in his life were both named after him. Simon Fraser didn't see the Pacific Ocean on this expedition, and there was something else he never saw. On his trip towards the coast, he made a note in his journal of a large river on the southern bank and a mountain beside it. If Fraser's expedition had followed this river, they would have found themselves on the mighty Sumas Lake, tucked away in a valley flanked by mountains to the northwest and southeast. But looking at maps of that same valley today, it's just a prairie, no lake anywhere to be seen. In 2021, the Sumas Prairie experienced devastating floods. Highways and roads were underwater, entire crop fields were submerged, and hundreds of thousands of livestock drowned. Looking from above, it would have appeared as though there was in fact a lake there. So what gives? What happened to Sumas Lake? Well, the short answer is, 100 years ago, a system of dikes, dams, and pumps was built to get rid of it. But how and why it was removed are two much more interesting questions. This is the story of how we got rid of a lake and why it keeps coming back. Before we can talk about where Lake Sumas went, we need to understand the lake's importance to the valley's first inhabitants, and its impact on the colonial settlers that would begin arriving to the valley in the late 19th century. The Fraser River is the longest in British Columbia, at a length of 1,375 kilometers. It acts as the drainage path to the Pacific Ocean for more than a quarter of the province's area, or just under the size of the entire United Kingdom. Before being named after Simon Fraser, the river was known to the native peoples living along its land through the lower mainland as Stalo, which in the language of Halkomelem means simply river. This was the river to them, and it shared such importance to the people living in the lower mainland that they themselves were named Stalo, people of the river. The Semath, or Sumas people, were those Stalo who lived mainly in the valley between Sumas Mountain on the Fraser's edge and Vedder Mountain to the south. Just as the Fraser was central to the identity of those who lived along it, the Semath people shared the name with the lake that would later be known to colonial settlers as Sumas Lake. Sumas Lake was central to the Semath way of life. For centuries, the culinary staple for those living along the Fraser was salmon. Salmon was abundant and frequently caught on the Fraser, but Lake Sumas was home to it and many other fish species, and was also a breeding ground for fish in the entire Fraser Valley. The things that grew and lived in and around the lake provided an abundant supply of food for the Semath, as well as materials for making everything from clothes to shelter to transportation. Lake Sumas was their supermarket, their one-stop shop for everything they needed to live. The first European colonists wouldn't establish themselves in the Fraser Valley until almost 2 decades after Fraser's expedition. The Hudson's Bay Company arrived in 1827 and erected Fort Langley on the Fraser River near the present-day city of Langley. The Hudson's Bay Company was hoping to capitalize on the untapped resources of the Fraser Valley for their fur trade business, but Fort Langley was ultimately not very successful in that mission. The Stalo embodied their culture in their name. They were people of the river. While they did occasionally hunt mammals in and around their territory, it was nowhere near as important as fishing for them, and they couldn't be bribed or encouraged by the fur traders into changing that. Because of this, Fort Langley eventually evolved to become a provisions post for food and other commodities, the most prevalent of which was fish from the Fraser. For 3 decades, Fort Langley held the only non-native presence in the Fraser Valley. In 1857, the Northwest Boundary Survey arrived to map out the border along the 49th parallel between the British and American claims to North America, as settled by the Oregon Treaty in 1846. In 1858, the demographics of the Fraser Valley began to change drastically. Rumors of gold found in the Fraser Canyon upstream the year prior were spread far and wide, making waves across the continent and even across the Pacific Ocean. By the end of 1858, over 30,000 non-native men had made their way through the Fraser River in hopes of finding their fortune. The main route through the Fraser Canyon was straight up the Fraser River if you were coming from the Pacific, but many thousands of those searching for gold came up from Washington by the Whatcom Trail, passing right through the Sumas Valley. While the promise of a new El Dorado in British Columbia turned up mostly empty, the enormous influx of migrants created a necessity for food, shelter, and transportation, which was seen as an opportunity for many, directly leading to the immigration of many permanent colonists to the valley. Over time, the valley was settled more and more by colonist families looking to put down roots and earn their living by working the land. In this time when British Columbia was still a colony and hadn't yet joined confederation with the Dominion of Canada, the main way settlers would legally acquire land was through a process called preemption. Preemption was a method by which colonial crown land in British Columbia that was unoccupied could be outright acquired at no charge, under the condition that the person making the claim would be using the land as their settlement and improving it for agricultural purposes. It was designed to encourage settlement and provide temporary title or permission to occupy land. There were also mechanisms for companies and partnerships to apply for preemption, with the earliest settlement preemptions occurring in 1859. This process was formally established in the colony of British Columbia by the 1870 Land Act, 1 year before the colony would join Canada as the province it is today. Preemption was widely used by white settlers to buy up property and establish themselves in the Sumas Valley, as well as around Abbotsford, Chilliwack, Sardis, and the rest of the Fraser Valley. And before you think of trying to go and preempt yourself a nice slice of crown land in BC, the government amended the Land Act in 1970 to eliminate this as a way of acquiring land in the province. Most of the lands that European settlers preempted and came to live on were unoccupied at the time they arrived. But a lot of it was still land that the natives used seasonally depending on what grew there or what could be hunted at certain times. As more and more white settlers immigrated to the valley, confrontation was inevitable about how these two vastly different cultures would come to share the same physical spaces. In 1864, this issue came to a head, and by the order of the first colonial governor James Douglas, the process of laying out reserves in the Fraser Valley began. For those who don't know, reserves are land set aside by the government for use by First Nations people. In principle, reserves were a way to define boundaries that both native and colonial settlers would use to keep to their own land in an effort to live in peace with each other. But in practice, it was often used as a tool of oppression to displace natives towards lands unsuitable for agriculture, such as rocky areas with poor soil quality or steep slopes, which would free up prime agricultural land for white settlement. Governor Douglas had previously worked for the Hudson's Bay Company and was married to a Métis woman, so he was more sympathetic to the issues facing the natives than most. In that year, 14 reserves were marked out along the entire Fraser Valley. The Sumas First Nations were split up into 2 reserves, totaling 7,600 acres. The natives were generally happy with this proposal, but the white settlers were not. Douglas would retire as governor later that year, and at the same time, Joseph Trutch was appointed Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works for the colony, putting him in charge of reserve allocations. When people in North America talk about how our current society is built upon centuries of colonial oppression, it's men like Joseph Trutch who are at the foundation. Trutch was a firm believer in the superiority of the British race and its civilization, and held abject disdain for natives in North America. In a letter to his mother about the native people in Oregon, he wrote, "I think they are the ugliest and laziest creatures I ever saw, and we should as soon think of being afraid of our dogs as of them." He believed that the land awarded to the natives was going to waste, and used his position to make sure he would give as much of it as he could to white settlers. In 1867, Trutch took his hatchet to the reserve proposal put forward under James Douglas, slashing the total reserve size of the Sumas First Nations from 7,600 acres to just 515. The maximum plot of land a single white settler could claim for preemption at the time was 160 acres, with the ability to buy additional land from the government at any time afterwards. With Trutch's new reserve allocation, this left the Upper Sumas Reserve with 55 acres per adult male, and just 3.4 acres per adult male at the Lower Sumas Reserve. Clearly, the deck was stacked against them, and the natives were outraged. There aren't really any silver linings to this part of the story, as is the case with a lot of the history of Indigenous relations in Canada. At the very least, while the new reserve boundaries no longer had the Sumas First Nation bordering Lake Sumas, they would still have access to the lake via the Sumas River. That is, until the white settlers figured out how to take that from them as well. For the colonists, there were several natural issues that came with living around Sumas Lake, the largest of which was flooding. Every spring thaw would bring freshets, where the melting snow and spring rain would funnel down the mountains, swelling the rivers and flooding the plains. The freshets from the Fraser River would raise the river's level above that of the Sumas River, sweeping those waters into Sumas Lake and the adjacent wetlands. Depending on the year, the freshets had the potential to drastically swell the size of Sumas Lake. The freshets from the Chilliwack River to the east were also a problem. Centuries ago, the Chilliwack River's natural path flowed north from Vedder Crossing, all the way until eventually dumping into the Fraser River. But in 1875, a log jam occurred at Vedder Crossing which restricted the water's natural path, resulting in overflow west into Vedder Creek and north into the Luckakuk and Atchalitz Creeks, flooding farms along both paths. The Chilliwack River's path north was completely jammed, so over the next 2 decades there was a lot of tension between the farmers along both paths about which path the river should be allowed to flow. As freshets arrived in the spring of 1894, the farmers along Luckakuk and Vedder Creeks would take turns building jams to control the flow of water down their own creeks, and then destroying the jams set up by their neighbors. Eventually the issue was brought to court. The judge in the trial determined that the river's historical route had been north towards the Fraser, and this should remain the case. He ordered the westward flow of the Chilliwack River to be rerouted north, but his decision was never carried out. Sardis held more political sway in the region at the time, and local officials used provincial funds to seal up the Luckakuk Riverhead, clear Vedder Creek of all obstructions, and solidify its banks with rock and gravel, transforming Vedder Creek into the Vedder River. This decision would end up having huge implications for the transformation of the Sumas Lake area in the decades to come. The rerouting of the Chilliwack River at Vedder Crossing was just a taste of the change that the Fraser Valley saw that year. That spring, the freshets brought so much water that the floodplains surrounding Lake Sumas were completely covered. Outside of the flood season, Lake Sumas would typically cover about 10,000 acres. In the spring of 1894, it had tripled in size. This flood was particularly bad because of the rerouting of the Chilliwack River at Vedder Crossing. Usually Sumas Lake would only be affected by freshets from the Fraser River, but with the Chilliwack River now feeding into it as well, the flooding got worse. To this day, the flood of 1894 remains the greatest flood in the Sumas Valley in recorded history. While the flood of 1894 was more catastrophic than most, the freshets would bring some amount of flooding every year, which was extremely disruptive to those living in the valley. Not only did it highlight the natural risks that the valley posed, but it threatened the agricultural ideal that so many had envisioned for their new home. The yearly floods that consumed the lake and surrounding wetlands were preventing nature from being what they wanted it to be, and it was their task to set about reclaiming that land. Not yet worrying about how it would be achieved, the idea to eliminate the lake was the most direct solution to their immediate problems. And flooding was not the only reason they had for wanting the lake gone. Another major problem tied to the lake was mosquitoes. During flood season, the lake's expanded footprint would create large swaths of still water that acted as breeding grounds for mosquitoes. As reports from the early 1900s mention, in particularly bad years, schools were forced to close and children were kept indoors for weeks. There are even reports of livestock that were killed by mosquitoes from blood loss. If the lake were drained, there would be nowhere for the mosquitoes to breed. This argument actually ended up being a huge part of the discussion in the court of public opinion that drove support for the idea to remove the lake. The third argument for draining the lake was the prospect of 10,000 acres of land that would be opened up for farming. Depending on your definition, 75 to 90% of British Columbia is covered by mountains, which is all land that ranges from impractical to straight up unusable for farming. Although it was prone to flooding, the land surrounding Lake Sumas had proven to be extremely fertile. The idea of adding to that supply of farmland while removing a nuisance for all the properties around it was just killing two birds with one stone. The last major reason to drain the lake was to make it easier to connect the lower mainland to the rest of the province. As we'll soon see, this was a crucial step in the story for how the plan to drain the lake was ultimately successful. Just to be completely clear, the idea to drain the lake was one that was dreamed up by colonists, and was never supported by the Sumas First Nation. Settlers arriving in the Fraser Valley in the late 1800s brought with them their own ideals and perspectives on how to use the land around them, which differed significantly from those of the Stalo people. The colonists sought to tame the wilds of this new land, building farms on which to sustain themselves and provide stability. They didn't see the lake as their supermarket, or care for the fact that the Sumas did. Instead, they saw a risk to the stability of their agricultural way of life. In their eyes, Sumas Lake was a beast that with enough time and effort could and would be tamed. The technical challenges of draining a 10,000-acre lake in a valley prone to flooding were not insignificant. It would require the construction of a system of dams, floodgates, and dikes. You know, big sloped walls made of dirt and rocks to keep water out, that kind of dike. As we'll soon see, what initially looked like a straightforward problem would eventually prove to be an enigma of an engineering task. Many would attempt to solve it. Several came close, but only one would finally succeed. The first serious proposal to address the flooding around Sumas Lake was made by English engineer Edward Mohun, who in 1871 suggested the construction of a dike along the lower bank of the Fraser River between Chilliwack and Sumas Mountains. A dam with a floodgate would also be built at the mouth of the Sumas River, which would be open most of the year to allow the Sumas River to drain into the Fraser, but would be closed during the spring freshet to stop the Fraser from flowing up the Sumas River and flooding. In his proposal to the government, he estimated that this project would cost just $15,000. The colony's capital of Victoria was busy at the time negotiating its way into becoming the 6th province of Canada, so they couldn't commit resources to the project at the time. A few years later, Mohun offered to raise the funds himself, and in return, he would be paid 5,000 acres of land reclaimed from the lake bed, as well as the right to buy up the rest of the drained land for $1 per acre. His employment terms were ridiculous even for the time, especially considering that the lake's boundaries were poorly defined from the constant swelling from floods. Ultimately, the province did not move forward with Mohun's proposal, as they determined it was too simple, leaving open a number of unaddressed issues. After major floods in 1876, farmers around Sumas Lake were pleading to the provincial government to do something to help them. In response, they sent renowned surveyor Edgar Dewdney to come up with a workable solution. He began his work in September of that year, and already by November had submitted his report to the province. This plan was specifically designed to protect the valley from flood levels seen in 1876, which were the worst seen to date at that point. Not that Dewdney could have predicted it, but it's worth noting that the flood of 1876 was a foot lower than the flood that came in 1882, and 3 feet below the Great Flood of 1894. Dewdney's plan was similar to that of Edward Mohun before him, but with more detail, including construction plans and blueprints for how the work should be carried out. There would be a dam and floodgate at the mouth of the Sumas River, as well as 2 more of these floodgate dams at nearby creeks to prevent further flooding from freshets but still allow the plains to drain in the off-season. His plan also included an additional dike running along the east bank of the Atchulets Creek to hold back any spillover flooding from the Fraser River near Chilliwack. Dewdney's proposal would protect the Sumas Valley from flooding due to the Fraser River, but he recognized the need to address the Chilliwack River as well. Otherwise, the whole drainage plan would be useless. Dewdney submitted his report in 1876, and the Chilliwack River logjam had occurred just a year prior. Dewdney spoke with many locals, trying to determine which path the Chilliwack should flow, But unsurprisingly, most people living near the Luckakuk and Vedder Creeks took a NIMBY stance and favored a river diversion away from their properties. Ultimately, he decided that the Luckakuk North was the best path to direct the Chilliwack River, as it was the most direct route from Vedder Crossing to the Fraser River. The estimated cost for Dewdney's entire plan came to a whopping $140,000. Dewdney's role in the story of Sumas Lake was purely a technical one, but in 1881 he went on to become Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories. In this role, he engaged in and oversaw the systematic starvation of thousands of indigenous people, earning him a place along Joseph Trutch in the colonial oppressor's Hall of Shame. While Dewdney's plan was never enacted, it gave weight to the cause and demonstrated that it could be possible to drain the lake. People were excited about the plan and wanted someone to make it a reality. Enter Ellis Luther Derby. Not much is known about Derby, other than the fact that he was an engineer from Ontario who had some experience working on diking projects in California. Off the back of Dewdney's plan, Derby made his case as the man to carry out the job, and with the Sumas Diking Act of 1878, Ellis Luther Derby was given provincial approval to drain the valley. Derby somehow managed to convince the province that for this work, his payment would be 51,000 acres of crowned land, which included the entire area of the lake bed and much more. That's almost twice the area of Vancouver today. I guess he was really good at negotiating. One significant change that Derby made to Dewdney's plan was to the dike along the Fraser. Where Dewdney recommended diking just between Chilliwack and Sumas Mountains, Derby wanted a dike from well east of Chilliwack all the way to Matsqui. Derby first focused his efforts on the dike at Matsqui, spending most of 1878 and 79 on this work. During this section's first test, the dike failed, before the freshets of 1880 even arrived. Not a single ounce of work was completed in the year after that. Same thing for the following year, and the next. Public opinion of the man and the project soured into the 1880s, as it became clear that Derby would not be completing the project on schedule, if at all. As it turns out, the Matsqui portion of the dike would be the sum total of work that Derby would ever carry out on the project, never even starting construction on the Sumas and Chilliwack portions. Derby died in 1887. A few months later, the provincial government nullified the Sumas Diking Act of 1878, and the plan to drain the lake was once again a dream. Following this, government support for the drainage project was at an all-time low. In 1877, then Provincial Finance Minister William Smith had appeared at several public appearances alongside Derby, promoting the project and the man behind it. By 1883, Smith had become Premier of the province and was doing his best to avoid the heat associated with the whole endeavour of draining Lake Sumas. Luckily for him, he found his scapegoat with the federal government. When British Columbia negotiated their way into Canada's Confederation, one of the colony's conditions was that a railway be built from eastern Canada all the way to British Columbia to connect the West to the rest of the country. Jurisdiction for the planned path for the Pacific Railway was under federal control, including 20 miles of land on either side of it. This railway belt included portions of the Sumas Lake diking area, so Premier Smith argued that any plans to dike or drain Lake Sumas now had to be brought to the federal government. After Derby, the next attempt to embark on a drainage plan for Lake Sumas was in the early 1890s by brothers Frank and John Lumsden, local dairy farmers and cattle breeders. Along with obtaining provincial approval for the project, the Lumsden brothers were awarded the right to purchase the land under the lake after successfully draining it. The brothers brought in an engineering consultant all the way from Holland to scope out the work. The proposed plan looked very similar to Dewdney's: dikes along the Fraser River and Atchelett's Creek, and a dam on the Sumas River. However, this plan also called for a tunnel to be drilled through Sumas Mountain, where water from the Sumas could be pumped out to the Fraser. You may be thinking, pumping water through a mountain tunnel? This is starting to sound expensive. And you would be correct. The Lumsden brothers ran out of funding just months after starting the preliminary work for the project, and were turned down by the province when asked for loans to keep afloat. The brothers were forced to sell off most of their livestock and farm equipment to avoid personal bankruptcy. In hindsight, it seems downright irresponsible for the Lumsdens to have been given approval for this magnitude of a project, when they had no experience in this kind of work, barely any capital to start the work, and no bank or provincial loans to carry the project to completion. It became clear to those in the valley that efforts to push forward with draining the lake would have to come from within and would have to be much more organized. In June of 1893, a board of commissioners were formed to create the Sumas Diking Commission, or the SDC. In the following spring, the Sumas Diking Act of 1894 was enacted that provided the commissioners with jurisdiction to authorize diking work in the valley. The commission hired engineering firm Keefe and Smith that same spring to survey the lake and submit their own drainage proposal. Their plan was similar to the Lumsden's, with the main difference being the inclusion of a dike along the Sumas River. Like Edgar Dewdney, the Keefe and Smith plan recognized the need to divert the Chilliwack River away from Sumas Lake for the project to be at all feasible. They recommended a northern channel for the Chilliwack River through the Lullaby, which would need significant reinforcement to minimize flood risk. This plan was submitted in May of 1894 and was the most technical and competent proposal to date. Unfortunately, just like every plan before it, it was destined to fail. Just 1 month after submitting their report, the Great Flood of 1894 arrived. The Keefe and Smith plan was designed under the assumption that the flood level of 1882 was the worst the valley was likely to experience, but the flood in 1894 was 2 full feet higher than in 82. As the floodwaters began to recede, that spring, the Sumas Diking Commission attempted to push forward with the construction of the Keefe and Smith proposal, requesting a bond of $340,000 from the province to finance it. As this request came in, the province was neck deep in trying to provide immediate support to those affected by the floods, and they just didn't have the resources to commit to long-term flood prevention at the time. The request was denied, and the Keefe and Smith plan was dead in the water. After the flood of 1894, hopes for the drainage plan were low, and it would take more than 10 years for the idea to gain traction again. In 1905, 3 investors from Chicago established the Sumas Development Company, not to be confused with the SDC. They had American engineers Daniel Meade and Sterling Hill draft yet another set of plans for Sumas Lake. This plan called for the usual dike on the Fraser, as well as a dam and pump house at the mouth of the Sumas River. The big innovation with this plan was the proposal of the Vedder Canal, which would reroute the Vedder River north and merge it with the Fraser. 3 dams would be built along the channel to control the speed of the water in the canal, which would otherwise flow too fast to be structurally supported, given the elevation difference between Vedder Crossing and the Fraser River. Despite finally having a proposal that addressed how the Chilliwack River could be diverted away from the communities along the paths of the Chilliwack and the Lullaby, there was surprisingly little support for it. There was dissent among experts about the viability of the plan, and locals were extremely distrustful of the Sumas Development Company, who hadn't even been formally incorporated by the time they were seeking approval for the project. And as it turns out, that distrust was warranted. As the proposal worked its way through the local and provincial approval loops, in 1907, the Sumas Development Company went bankrupt. It turns out that they were essentially a paper company with no real assets, except for the engineering documents that they had commissioned from Meade and Hill. As things were turning south for the Sumas Development Company, the British Columbia Electric Railway Company, or the BCER, was beginning work of their own in the Sumas Valley. In 1907, while the Sumas Development Company was in the middle of collapsing, the BCER was in the process of constructing an electric rail line from New Westminster to Chilliwack, and the stretch through the Sumas Valley was anticipated to be the hardest part of the job. Surveyors for the BCER had planned out a potential route directly northeast through Sumas Lake, and it was decided that draining the lake was the best path forward for the planned railway. So, in March of 1908, the BCER bought out what was left of the Sumas Development Company for $70,000, and moved forward with their own assessment on the drainage of Sumas Lake. For this work, they brought in American hydraulic engineer Francis LeBaron. LeBaron submitted his proposal on May 14th of 1909, and it was inarguably the most innovative solution proposed to this point. The key development in his proposal related to the construction of a canal north for the Vedder River. The key difference between LeBaron's Vedder Canal and that proposed by Meade and Hill before him was that he would allow the Vedder to flow for 4 miles west of Vedder Crossing, allowing the river to follow its natural course and lose close to 80 feet of elevation. At this point, the water would be slow enough that it could be diverted north towards the Fraser along a channel with high dikes on both sides, spaced widely so the water's flow would slow even more. With the water's hydraulic energy spent before entering the diked area, there was less risk that the water's current would cause damage to the protective structures. The second innovation to his plan focused on what he saw as a failure point in all designs in the 40 years before his. With only one dike along the Fraser, a single breach would cause the entire valley to flood. He proposed sectioning off the prairie into 3 units, so that if any one dike failed, it would not flood the entire valley. This unit system would also make it possible to complete the construction of the project in clearly defined phases. Remember back to what I said about the Mead and Hill proposal being doubted by experts at the time? Well, the expert that disagreed with the plan was actually LeBaron, and it would come back to bite him, because the BCER hired Hill to survey with LeBaron and review his plan, which he in turn rejected, claiming that there were several serious issues in his plan and that it lacked consideration for local conditions. At this point, the BCER had 2 design proposals to assess, one from LeBaron and the old Mead and Hill plan. A detailed cost assessment of both plans priced LeBaron's plan at $1.55 million, and Mead and Hill's at about $1.8. At this point, the BCER realized that this project would cost way too much given what they stood to gain from it, which was about 10 kilometers of railway. The company abandoned the drainage plan altogether. They instead opted to build their railway on the south end of the valley, following a path east to the base of Vedder Mountain and then all the way up to Chilliwack. Connecting the province to the rest of the country with railways was a top priority at the time, and it was this failed proposal among all of those that came before it that truly showed how difficult of an undertaking this project was. If a private company with all the right personnel, expertise, capital, and local knowledge deemed this project unprofitable, there was little to no possibility of this project ever being completed. That is, unless there was direct government involvement. I'm going to mostly gloss over the 8th attempt, as it was unsurprisingly another bust. To summarize, in 1911 an American company proposed to move forward with the Mead and Hill plan again, but over the 6 years in which they held the right to work on the drainage project, no money was raised and no work was completed. There, that one was short. Next up to the task was former BCER engineer Frederick Sinclair. Sinclair was an American railroad engineer who actually carried out the initial surveys for the BCER when they were assessing whether a railroad through the bed of a drained Lake Sumas was feasible. Although he was not specialized in hydraulic or dike engineering like some of his predecessors on this list, Sinclair was specially equipped due to his work experience and local knowledge of the area. He had drafted a report in October of 1913, and for the most part it was basically a rehashing of LeBaron's plan. Sinclair's proposal just happened to come at a better time. Sinclair submitted his plan to the SDC in 1914, which was approved by the locals and then presented to the province in 1917. The provincial election of 1916 saw the Liberal Party sweep into a majority government, and they were the closest thing to an ally that the drainage project would have. Agricultural Minister John Oliver, nicknamed Honest John, was a strong advocate for settling returned World War I veterans in British Columbia, and the Sumas drainage plan would provide a large amount of land on which to carry that out. That year, the provincial government established the Land Settlement Board, or LSB, which was meant to be an arm's-length branch within the Department of Agriculture, whose objective would be to foster modern agricultural development in British Columbia. Through mutual agreement between the province and advocates for the Sumas drainage project, the LSB took control of the SDC in early 1918. This was a huge development for the project. This went from being locally to provincially led, and had a much higher chance of actually being carried out. The financial plan for the project was that the SDC would take out bank loans for the upfront work on the project, and once it was complete, they would be able to sell all the land from below the lake to pay their bills. The goal was for the project to pay for itself in its entirety. Around the same time that the LSB had officially taken over the SDC, BC Premier Harlan Brewster died from pneumonia that he caught on a winter trip to meet with Prime Minister Borden in Ottawa. This led to Honest John becoming Premier for the province, as well as Chilliwack local and Member of Legislative Assembly Edward Barrow being promoted to Minister of Agriculture. In this role, Barrow would be in the uncomfortable position of heading the LSB and leading the campaign of public support for the Sumas drainage project, while the provincial government itself was still wary of taking full responsibility for it. While Fred Sinclair was the engineer who put the plan back on the province's map, he was not asked to continue on with the project after the establishment of the LSB. Instead, provincial engineers were handed the task. Chief Engineer Harvey Bryce and Associate Engineer Chester Smith to be specific. After a year of surveying and work, in January of 1919, they submitted a whopping 63-page report with their plan, which as it turns out was basically the same as Sinclair's proposal, which itself was basically the same as LeBaron's. The notably new aspect to the Bryce-Smith plan included a separate assessment on whether it would be possible to partially reclaim the land around Sumas Lake without actually draining it. One noteworthy aspect of the report submitted by Bryce and Smith is that it directly stated that this project's magnitude and need for upfront investment made it incompatible with the private business model, and that it should be carried out by a government body one way or another. This was the first and only time a project engineer on this project would ever come out and say this. And they were right. This was, in its essence, a public's work project that would not only directly benefit the Sumas area, but the province as a whole. But the province still wanted to be able to keep the drainage project at arm's length. They did not want to deal with the inevitable questions of how the project would be paid for, as well as the fear that another failure of the project would reflect poorly on the Liberal government at the time. These comments from Bryce and Smith were never addressed publicly by anyone in government. Their cost estimates showed that the full drainage plan was clearly the most expensive, but it would also free up the most land. However, their plans showed not only would it be technically feasible to leave Sumas Lake as is while freeing up and protecting the surrounding land, but it was just as cost effective on a per acre basis. However, the local settlers had spent the last nearly 50 years dreaming and scheming of ways to get rid of the lake, and wanted it in their rear view. The province also had their own agenda. As stated by Agriculture Minister Barrow, the board's policy was not to buy lands already under cultivation. Our policy is to add to the production of the province by bringing into cultivation as much virgin soil as possible adjacent to transportation and markets. So yes, it could have been possible to keep Lake Sumas while protecting the surrounding area and developing some new land around the lake, but the sentiment was that the lake just had to go. So, with a plan in hand, the province quickly gave their approval to the LSB and asked for a final report from Bryce and Smith. However, just weeks later in March of 1919, Bryce fell ill and died, leaving a hole in the project's engineering leadership. Here, for some unknown reason, Smith was not promoted to chief engineer, and instead, Fred Sinclair was asked to join on and lead the project going forward. This could be seen as a direct result of the comments Smith and Bryce had made earlier in their report that directly implicated the need for government involvement in the project, where the province preferred to remain aloof, but it's not for certain. Regardless, this arrangement left both Smith and Sinclair at odds. Smith was obviously upset for having been passed on the role of chief engineer, and Sinclair, while he was hired to lead the project, was not actually given the job of chief engineer, but rather associate engineer, which was the same title and salary as Smith. Sinclair also presumably harbored some resentment for having been passed on the project after his initial proposal, and for the Bryce-Smith plan, which he considered to be more or less a rehashing of his plan, which is pretty rich considering where he got his plan from. Tensions were so bad that by the summer of 1919, the pair had stopped working together entirely and submitted separate reports for the final plan. Both plans followed the main structure initially proposed by LeBaron, but differed only on the small potatoes. Things like where the exact location of each piece of infrastructure would be. Both plans had the Vetter Canal start in the same spot on the Vetter River, but Sinclair had it join the Sumas River 800 feet upstream from where Smith wanted it. The pump house and dam on the Sumas River was included in both proposals, but with a difference in location of about 3,000 feet. The Fraser River Dike was put north of the Canadian Northern Railway line in Smith's plan and south of the line in Sinclair's. Sinclair put his estimate for the total project works at just over $1.15 million, while Smith gave the more pragmatic estimate of just under $1.45 million. On July 15th of 1919, Sinclair and Smith headed to Victoria to make their pitches to the Premier, Minister Barrow, and the LSB. Smith went first. Having barely begun to explain his plan, he was cut off by the Premier, who became fixated on one of those small potato details. He was appalled by the fact that Smith had proposed to place his Fraser Dike north of the Canadian National Railway line, and accused Smith of proposing to protect the interests of a $40 million Crown corporation using tax money from the Sumas farmers. Honest John and Minister Barrow stormed out of the room, but were convinced to return to hear out Sinclair's plan. Before Sinclair could start, Honest John asked Sinclair point blank where he was proposing to put the Fraser Dike. Because Sinclair's plan called for having it south of the railway, he was allowed to continue with his proposal. And that sealed it. After this meeting, Sinclair was soon promoted to chief engineer and given the role of overseeing the next phase of the project. It's unclear if this was due to Honest John's disdain for a proposal that would simultaneously benefit the Sumas area as well as a federally chartered company, or because Sinclair had a lower project cost estimate, or if it was in some way retaliation for Bryson Smith's untoward comments about the need for provincial involvement in their first report. Either way, after the meeting in Victoria, Chester Smith was notified that his services were no longer required and was let go. On November 22nd of 1919, Fred Sinclair's plan to drain Lake Sumas was presented to a public meeting of stakeholders, including landowners from around the lake, representatives from the LSB, as well as Minister Barrow and Premier Oliver. After the meeting began, the engineers were called on to explain their plans, but before they could begin, the Premier interrupted the meeting to take the stage and declare that the provincial government is taking no responsibility whatsoever for this scheme. Understand that clearly. There were speculations that the provincial government would be financially backing the upfront costs for the project, to which Honest John again, not beating around the bush, said the government guarantees nothing at all, and that it was the job of the engineer to lay out a financing plan. After a brief overview of the engineering aspects of the project, most of the discussion revolved around the costs. Fred Sinclair put his estimate at a cool $1.5 million, much closer to the estimate that Chester Smith had initially provided. I guess sometimes all you have to do to come out on top is lower your prices until you push out the competition, then bring those prices right back up when you've got the monopoly. The decision to move forward with Fred Sinclair's plan came down to a vote at this meeting by the landowners, and was approved by a landslide of 141 for and 21 against. 4 months later, the cost estimate for the project had increased by $300,000, which was approved in an even larger landslide vote of 102 for and 5 against. And with these votes, it was finally settled. At long last, the lake's death warrant had been signed, and this time there was no escape. On April 16th of 1920, the provincial legislature approved the Sumas Reclamation Project, which gave the project permission to begin construction. Tenders were put out in newspapers calling for bids for construction of different phases of the project, and the SDC began buying out the land along the path of the future Vetter Canal, which cost the commission just over $75,000. White landowners were paid out about $100 per acre, while the 27 acres of Sumas First Nation Reserve along the canal's path were paid out with just $189, or about $7 per acre. Yet another example of the disproportionate treatment of natives by the government over the course of this project. There were several aspects to the project that made construction particularly difficult. The first was the shortened construction season. Because the freshets caused floods in the valley in the late spring, it was effectively impossible to do any work on the project in the summer months. This meant that work crews had to be extremely productive during the rest of the year, which was particularly difficult in the winter months during harsh weather and reduced hours of sunlight. The seasonal flooding was also problematic since it had the potential to completely wash away work from the previous year. However, due to the unit system design, it was possible for all resources to be concentrated on a single portion of the project, with the goal of completing a unit before the next flood season came around. The first work year began in August of 1920. The target for this working year was to complete the entire East Prairie unit, which included excavating a path for the Vetter Canal and using that soil to build the East Vetter Dike. However, the construction company awarded the contract for the bulk of the excavation work struggled with securing equipment required to stay on track, putting them behind schedule for most of the first year. The East Prairie unit was not complete by the time spring came around, which combined with the historically high waters from the freshet of 1921 resulted in most of the work from the prior season being washed away in the flood, leaving them with very little to show for their entire first year of work. The second work year was crucial for the project, as they needed to make up for the prior year's lost time and restore the public's diminished confidence in the plan. Work on the Vetter Canal using suction dredges began in August of 1921, when the floodwaters began receding. Suction dredges are essentially small boats equipped with giant vacuums that suck up soil from underwater. In the case of the Vetter Canal, the soil excavated as the canal was carved out was used to build up the dikes on either side of the channel. A single electric suction dredge began work from the south end of the Vetter Canal, working its way north. It was joined by 2 more dredges in March of 1922, as the spring freshet was rapidly approaching and risked washing away another year's worth of work if the East Prairie unit was not completed on time. By the end of May, however, the diversion of the Vetter River into the Vetter Canal was complete, along with all the key dikes in the East Prairie unit. On June 9th, the Fraser River's high water level peaked, but for the first time in history, the East Sumas Prairie stayed dry through the summer. The plan had worked. This momentum carried into the 3rd year of work, when attention shifted to the West Prairie unit, which was nowhere near complete. The goals for this season were the completion of the West Prairie unit, as well as the dam and pump house at the mouth of the lower Sumas River. The suction dredges worked to build up the dike along the Sumas River, as well as to create the drainage canal in the middle of the lake bed, which would later direct water to the pump house. The soil excavated from the Sumas lake bed and the Sumas River was sandy and loose, which made it poor diking material. They frequently had issues with the embankments sliding back into the river as they were being deposited. Meanwhile, the dam's construction began in early 1922, headed by Assistant Engineer G.P. Moe, who reported to Sinclair. Moe had the freedom to adjust the design proposed by Sinclair as he saw fit, and ended up selecting a new site for the dam and pump house some 3,000 feet further up from the mouth of the lower Sumas River from where Sinclair had originally proposed it, due to the superior foundation at this point along the river. Coincidentally, this was the exact location that Chester Smith had proposed in his initial plan. The dam, pump house, and most of the diking in the West Prairie was complete by the end of the 3rd year. The 4th and final year of construction was focused on tying up all the loose ends and finally draining the lake through the pump house. By the end of August 1923, the pump house was operating at full capacity, slowly taking the waters from Sumas Lake and putting them into the Fraser River for good. On June 26th of 1924, the LSB announced that the last of the water remaining in the Sumas Lake Basin was pumped out. More than 50 years after the first proposal to drain Lake Sumas, it was finally done. The water was gone, and the lake bed was on its way to becoming a prairie. Fred Sinclair wasn't the first to try to solve the problem with Sumas Lake, and he wasn't even the last. But in the end, he had developed a plan that addressed all the foreseeable issues, and presented it at a time when the political climate was favorable. Part of what caught my interest in particular when researching the story was how most articles covering the history of Sumas Lake list Fred Sinclair as the man with the plan, the grand engineer who slayed the watery beast. And to be fair, he spent more than a decade of his life seeing this project through. But as we've seen, his plan was built upon all those who came before him, including some of the key innovations that were essential to the project's success. Unfortunately for Sinclair, his role in the story does not end completely happily. In March of 1920, the project's estimated cost sat at $1.8 million. It became clear early on in the first year of work that this was a significant underestimation, and that much more capital would be required to complete the project. By the end of 1924, the SDC announced that the full cost of completed work was over $3.3 million, more than double the initial proposal of $1.5 made by Sinclair in 1919 that got the project approved in the first place. Late in 1923, after most of the construction was completed, the LSB promoted G.P. Moe to chief engineer and fired Fred Sinclair in an effort to pin the budgetary bloat on him. Over the next 2 decades, the province would fail to make back as much as they expected on the sale of lands from underneath the lake, in large part due to the stunted economy of the Great Depression. As a result, the loans taken out to finance the construction had remained unpaid. By the end of 1944, high interest rates caused the total project cost to balloon to $9.1 million. In the mid-1960s, the province acknowledged that this was a bill that was never going to be paid without help. The debt was taken over by the province, and eventually paid out by provincial taxpayers, just as it originally would have been if the province had treated the drainage project as a public works affair in the first place. Once the lake was drained, things were not suddenly hunky-dory in the Sumas Valley. the geographical conditions of the valley meant the area was still in danger from extreme weather events that could and would eventually lead to flooding. Early in 1935, a large accumulation of snowfall in January quickly melted when temperatures suddenly rose, overwhelming the valley's drainage system and flooding the prairie. As a result, a house near the highway was ripped straight from its foundations and washed away towards the road, crashing directly into the only power lines that fed the Sumas Prairie pumping station. With the pumping station offline and the dikes breached, Sumas Lake had been resurrected. It was estimated that $500,000 worth of damages occurred from this flood alone. The landowners at the time would joke that they weren't selling land by the acre, but by the gallon. 1948 brought the worst flood to the Fraser Valley since 1894. Flooding occurred all along the Fraser River, with some of the worst in Greendale, Mission, and Agassiz. By some miracle, the Sumas Prairie was mostly spared, but the damage to the Fraser Valley as a whole was significant. 16,000 people were evacuated, 10 were killed, and an estimated $150 million worth of damages were done. Nearly 200 miles of the Fraser Valley's diking infrastructure had to be rebuilt as a result of the damage done by this flood. The story goes on like this over and over and over. Another decade or so, another massive flood along the Fraser. All of the infrastructure built to drain the lake mostly did its job to keep the water out from the valley, but when it didn't, it was catastrophic. And as bad as it sounds, there's a key part of the story that we haven't even covered yet. Something that contributed massively to some of the biggest floods in the valley. And to be honest, it's one of the most complicated parts of this whole story. Let's talk about the Nooksack River. The Nooksack is located in Whatcom County in northeast Washington state. The river is primarily fed by three tributaries: North Fork, Middle Fork, and South Fork. These three tributaries are the main catchment areas for rain and melting snow off of Mount Baker and Mount Shuksan. For reference, Mount Baker is the third tallest mountain in the state and is one of the snowiest places in the world. In 1999, it set the world record for most snowfall in a single season of 95 feet. All the snow that melts off Baker in the spring feeds directly into the Nooksack and contributes to its cumulative volume. The Nooksack River flows northwest from the mountains towards the township of Everson, then begins a southward arc, eventually depositing its contents into the Pacific Ocean near Bellingham. At least, this is the river's current path. Historically, where the Nooksack now veers northwest, it once flowed north through to the upper Sumas River, eventually feeding into Sumas Lake and draining into the Fraser. As far back as records go, the Nooksack's northern path had naturally been diverted towards the west before colonial settlers arrived in the lower mainland. However, the terrain and elevation gradient of that path remained. The upper headwaters of the Sumas River lie just a few hundred meters away from the Nooksack, so heavy rainfall on the Cascade Mountains carried through the Nooksack has the potential to flood the riverbeds near Everson and use the upper Sumas River as an overflow channel for all of the excess water that the Nooksack can't handle itself. This is exactly what happened in 1990. In November of that year, heavy rainfall on the slopes of Mount Baker overwhelmed the Nooksack River, causing the roaring waters to overtop the riverbanks and overflow across farm fields, veering downhill to the north through the old path of the Sumas River. This led the overflow straight through to the border town of Sumas, Washington, making its way north of the border and into the Sumas Prairie. The overflow of the Nooksack also contributed to prior floods, but the flood of 1990 was the first in modern history that was directly and only a result of the Nooksack River overflow. After the 1990 flood, Whatcom County created a committee that would investigate flood prevention and management measures for the Nooksack River. This was a committee composed of politicians and community members from along the Nooksack, but there was no representation from anyone north of the Canada-US border who represented the communities in the Nooksack's overflow path. One of the first decisions put forward to the committee was to consider building dikes along the Nooksack to prevent overflow north past Everson. To be clear, this was not a decision whether to build the dikes or not. This was whether they even wanted to consider this as a serious option. The committee decided not to. In the committee's flood hazard management plan published in 1999, they openly admitted that this was not because of engineering or geographical feasibility, but that the management strategy of preventing all overflows and directing all the flow downstream is not likely to be politically feasible. Municipal studies have also taken place north of the border. In 2020, the city of Abbotsford published a report to assess flood mitigation plans specifically related to the overflow of the Nooksack. The main purpose of this document was to present the findings of a cost-benefit analysis of 3 solutions they considered the most viable for what could be done to minimize damage from the floods due to the Nooksack River like the one in 1990. The first option was to construct a new floodway and build a tunnel through Sumas Mountain to direct Sumas River high flows. The study found that this option provided minimal benefit for its cost of $580 million, and was therefore not recommended. The second option was to raise the dikes protecting the old Sumas lake bottom in combination with floodproofing each building with ring dikes, and constructing area dikes for high-density areas. This option would have a capital cost of $339 million. The final option was to construct a structure at Everson to block all overflows from the Nooksack River. At a cost of just $29 million, option number 3 was found to provide the highest benefit when looking only at Canada-side damages, as the cost to expand the existing levee system in Everson to block the Nooksack River overflows is significantly lower than the flood damages in the Sumas Prairie. The problem with this option, which Abbotsford's flood plan report does identify, and the reason why it's such a complicated problem to solve, is because building infrastructure to prevent the Nooksack from overflowing north at Everson would have knock-on effects for all of the communities along the Nooksack downstream of Everson. If there was no overflow of the Nooksack north into the Sumas River, all of that excess water would continue downstream. This could strain their drainage system and potentially overflow areas further along the Nooksack's path, which would in turn require additional flood prevention infrastructure to be built. Clearly, a major part of this problem is that there are 2 countries occupying the same region, unwilling or politically unable to come to an agreement that would benefit them both. Realistically, nothing will be done about overflows from the Nooksack unless there is more pressure from Canada to make this a provincial or federal policy issue, which seems kind of unlikely with the way things have been managed so far. In 2013, the Sumas First Nation filed a land claim against the federal government, which sought compensation for damages caused by the removal of the lake. There is little to no chance that the lake would ever willingly be brought back, but there is an opportunity to make reparations with the descendants of a community that were significantly marginalized by the removal of the lake and who had the most to lose with its disappearance. The Sumas Prairie today is some of the most productive agricultural land in Canada, but it is also some of the most vulnerable. In 2016, an inspection report contracted out by the province revealed that more than 100 kilometers of dikes across the Fraser Valley did not meet the necessary standards required to adequately protect the region from floods. After the floods in 2021, the province, as well as the municipalities in the valley, were rightfully criticized for failing to take action on weaknesses in the valley's infrastructure, which were identified in this report more than 6 years prior. The story of Sumas Lake and the Sumas Prairie is fascinating, bold, tragic, and full of history. While the valley today is a result of decisions made decades and centuries ago, its future will be decided by those alive today. Sumas Lake may be gone, but its story is far from over.